All right, we're live.
Daniel, how you doing?
I'm doing great today. It's been a good week.
Good. Excited to get into our discussion today. What are we talking about?
We're going to talk about the Greek gods today, but through the lens of the next great philosopher, and that is Xenophanes.
Xenophanes.
Xenophanes. They have great names, don't they?
They do have good names. That's the name of our next son.
I like it.
Yeah.
I'm sure Abby will be down with that. So it's spelled Xenophanes. Xenophanes.
Xenophanes. Gotcha. Okay, so as we get into discussing him today, I was wondering if you could put us in context a little bit, remind us of where we've been.
Yeah, let's do that. So this is actually the fourth episode in the history of philosophy, and the first one we talked about the seedbed of Greek thought, as it were, the intellectual atmosphere, the ideas that would be in the air and that people would just kind of take for granted, maybe not even realize that these were ideas or arguments that you could argue about or believe or disbelieve. There's an old joke that if you want to know what water is, don't ask a fish. And that's kind of the idea, that sometimes there's these cultural motifs and ideas in our minds that we just take for granted. So we talked about that in the first episode.
Remind us again, what are some of the pervasive philosophical thought that some of these early pre-Socratic philosophers are enveloped in?
Yeah, so we talked about a few of them. One is impersonal fate rules the destiny of humans. It's not a creator God or providential God who's overseeing all things. It's impersonal fate. The universe just is. There's no explanation. There's no creation of the universe. Individual things within creation have origin stories, but not the universe itself. There seemed to be this idea, you've probably heard of this before, that there are four elements: water, air, fire, and earth. And yet there's also this idea that somehow there's a oneness to all things. There is one reality that everything else kind of flows out of and flows into. And we talked about that a little bit as this shapeless stream. And that idea that there is this current of reality that's a oneness, and that every individual things, plants, humans, whatever, arise out of that, take on existence for a while, and then go back into that, goes all the way back to the Minoan civilization on Crete, which was really the forebearers of Greek thought. And then maybe two more things we could mention here. That the gods exist, the Olympian gods, and then more particularly, that a multitude of gods exist as part of the furniture of the universe. So there's not one God who exists, who creates the universe. The universe is here, and within this universe, there are these beings that they call the gods that have these special powers, sometimes associated with different aspects of nature or human society. That's all in the air.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful framework. And then some of the earliest philosophers that we've looked at that articulated philosophical systems that have started on some of these premises were, what were some of their names?
So the first three philosophers we looked at were Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes. And these were all Greeks. They were living on the west coast of Turkey in Greek colonies. So a little bit across the Aegean Sea from the Greek mainland. They were all writing relatively the same time. There seems to be kind of a chronology there: Thales, Anaximander, and then Anaximenes. A little bit unclear of their dates, but for the most part, the late 6th century BC, early 7th century at best. And they're all in particular from the city of Miletus, which was one of those Greek colonies. So this is also called the Milesian school, or the Milesian philosophers. They were okay with the ideas I just mentioned, but they were asking, what is that one thing? If there is one thing, what is that? And for Thales, it was water. Everything is somehow water in its various forms. For Anaximenes, it is air. A later thinker, Heraclitus, says it's fire.
Earlier you said that an old joke is if you want to know what water is, you shouldn't ask a fish. It sounds like if you want to know what water is, you really probably should ask Thales.
That's true.
It sounds like he's your guy.
Yeah, he was all about that.
Yeah, that take. So.
Now, as far as I know, no one argued that all things are earth, maybe because earth is the least changeable of those four elements, right?
Mm-hmm.
Anaximander, we mentioned him. He also believed that there is one fundamental thing. The Greek word is arche. So it's not water, it's not fire, it's not air. For him, It was the infinite or the boundless or the unlimited, this shapeless stream of life force, or better, existence force that flows in and through all individual things, into which they return after existing.
Yeah, and I remember kind of exploring how that almost feels like some philosophies that were developing in the East as far as like pantheism goes, and kind of some similarities there, not exactly, but just a little bit.
Yeah, there are very much similarities between the pantheistic monism of the East and what these guys were proposing.
Yeah. And then I also remember you saying that it's not necessarily that their ideas were the best, more about how they were thinking about them that made them kind of stand out as early philosophers, or the earliest philosophers.
Right. What makes them philosophers and the earliest philosophers, the ones who contribute to this great conversation, is not the answers they gave, but the kind of questions they asked, first of all, and then secondly, the way that they tried to answer those questions. Not through the received myths of their culture or religious text, but through using the human mind. Now, implicit within that project, however, as we talked about last week quite a bit, is a presupposition that the human mind, autonomously, that is, unaided by anything outside itself, could give true answers to these questions. That was a presupposition because it was assumed, and it wasn't argued for. But unless it's true, then the whole project is in vain, right?
Right. So that's a good segue, because today we're going to be talking about Xenophanes, and in reading some of the notes here, he's going to talk a little bit about that. So
yeah,
let's transition into that. Why don't you introduce us to Xenophanes? Give us a little bit of background, and then we'll carry on with the conversation.
All right. So he was a Greek, like Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes. He was an Ionian, that he was living on these Greek colonies on the east part of the Aegean Sea, what's now the west part of Turkey. Those three all lived in Miletus. He lived in Colophon, which is about 40 miles up the coast. And we're told that when the Persian Empire expanded into Ionia, all these Ionian colonies, that he fled, and he lived the rest of his life in Sicily, which is right off the toe of Italy, of course. And Sicily, like most of southern Italy at that point, was colonized by Greek-speaking people and Greek culture.
And so why is he important to intellectual and philosophical history?
Well, this may be an overstatement, but I feel like with him we come to the first great advance in philosophy.
That's a big statement.
Yeah, I guess it is.
Okay, so help us understand that. How so?
I say that because I think he advances in three ways. First, he was the first to emphatically reject the Greek gods as fictitious. That was important because the Greek gods and all the myths around them were part of the very fundamental nature of Greek society.
Yeah, that's a big shift.
Yeah, it is. And then second, because of that, he was able to derive an idea of God by reasoning. So he's kind of like the first Greek, or the first in this flow of thought, that's developing their idea of God that's not based on Homer and the other myth writers.
So he's not an atheist?
Yeah, we'll come back to that point.
Okay. So he's going to argue for some kind of God or something, but
yeah,
he rejects the pantheon?
Yes.
Okay.
And then third, he was the first to think critically about the ability of human reasoning and knowledge. So really, he was the first one to deal with one of the three main branches of philosophy, which is epistemology.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So let's talk about each of these. So the first one, you said he emphatically rejects the Greek gods. He says that they're fictitious. So what does he have against the Greek gods?
Right. And maybe I overstated. It's not so much the gods himself, but how they were portrayed by the two great Greek poets, Hesiod and Homer, and therefore how they were understood and conceived by the people as a whole. He argues that these pictures of the gods is unworthy and reproachable. Here's a quote from him. Homer and Hesiod have attributed to the gods all those things which in men are a matter of reproach and censure, stealing, adultery, and mutual deception. And that's true. I mean, if you look at Homer's gods, morally they are no better than the band of ruthless warrior barons that they're probably modeled after. Let me give you an example story from Hesiod. Hesiod and Homer are the great Greek poets. They're the ones who set the stage for all that we know about pretty much Greek mythology. Their works were kind of like the Bible was in the Middle Ages. It was just the foundation of their culture. And Hesiod has a story of how things are created. One of the great stories he mentions is Kronos, who's the father of Zeus. And he goes to his father and castrates him because he's taken the side of his mother in a dispute. And so he castrates him, and this is all part of this larger story in which Zeus eventually gains the supremacy. And then Zeus himself, of course, has all kinds of affairs and really rapes. If you look at it through modern eyes, I think you would call it that. But he's also a deceiver and can be deceived. For example, have you ever read the Iliad?
No, I haven't.
Well, get educated, boy.
Yeah.
So it's a story of the Greek gods working in this Trojan War. Ostensibly, it's about the Greek attack on Troy, but really it's more the gods working through these men. So it's almost like they're an extension of the gods, as it were. But for various reasons, different gods take different sides of conflict. Some like the Greeks, some like the Trojans. Wants to protect Hector, who was the great prince of the Trojans. And so he's giving him his strength and his power and giving him aid in this. And Hera, his wife, doesn't like this. She's on the other side. She wants the Greeks to be victorious. So she works with Aphrodite, one of the other gods, and Hera seduces Zeus. And then he falls in this deep post-coital sleep. And while doing that, then while his attention is away because first sex and then sleep, that's when Hector gets wounded in this, all right? And then Zeus wakes up and he lambasts her, he threatens to whip her, you know? And that's just one example. There are dozens, if not hundreds of examples of the gods committing adultery, deceiving each other, being dishonest. And so basically what he's saying is, hey guys, is this really what we want to base our society on? I mean, this isn't really good optics for the kids, right?
It's interesting that he recognized that they weren't moral exemplars.
No, far from it. We talked about last time, I'm pretty sure that if you put an average Greek person next to Zeus himself, the Greek person would be more moral than he was, a Greek person at that time. So that was his first critique.
Okay, so he really pushes back against Homer's and Hesiod's portrayal of the gods. And so he basically says that they don't exist?
Basically, yeah, he views Homer and Hesiod as inventing all these stories. And he argues that all that they're doing and all we've done in following them is make these gods in our own image.
So were their stories figments of the creative imaginations, or were they cultural stories passed down through oral tradition that they just recorded?
Yeah, that's a question that people are still debating.
Okay.
Especially with Homer, because we don't really know the date that Homer was written. Some people argue that the Iliad and the Odyssey weren't even written by the same author. Other people would say that the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey have been framed by troubadours and poets through oral tradition and then written tradition through many centuries, so there is not one Homer. So when we're talking about this, we're basically talking about the texts that we have right now.
Which were presumably written before Xenophanes, right?
Oh yeah, much earlier.
Okay. So they've shaped culture, and Xenophanes just outright rejects it because they're morally horrible. They're not the kinds of people or persons that you want to base your society on.
Right. And that's kind of his next criticism, is that these gods are made in man's image, not that we are made in God's image. So sometimes you hear someone who thinks they're very clever, oh, I don't think we're made in God's image. I think we made God in our image, that's a very new and profound thought. Yeah, that goes back about 2,500 years ago, and he was the person who made that critique. And he wrote it this way: Ethiopians made their gods snub-nosed and black. The Thracians made theirs gray-eyed and red-haired, like themselves. And if oxen and horses had hands and could draw, horses would draw their gods in the shape of horses, and oxen in the shape of an ox.
I see. So he's just mocking.
Yeah, it's a pretty good line, though.
Yeah, it's pretty clever. I like it.
Yeah.
But earlier we were talking about how he still uses the language of God, but he's not a polytheist per se, but he's not atheist, or how would you kind of categorize his perspective about God?
Yeah, if that's all we knew of him, or if we just stopped there, we'd probably say, oh, the guy's an atheist, But in fact, more the opposite is true. And that brings us to kind of the second point, that he believed in God and formulated his conception of God by reasoning about what God would be like if he really is so much greater than us, and not being content with these stories of many gods that have been handed down to him. He wrote this: "There is one God, greatest among gods and men, in no way similar to mortals in either body or mind." That's remarkable. As far as I know, he is the first Greek to argue for something that could be called monotheism. And this God is radically different than we are. So he's not just like us, but with some superpowers like the Olympian gods. It's ambiguous if he believed that there were lesser gods as well. In one of his poems, he says poets should devote pious hymns to the gods and not speak of war or the clash between giants and titans, as Hesiod and Homer were wont to do. So it's a little bit ambiguous, but he seems to argue that there's primarily one God who's different than us in every way.
And so he goes against the cultural presupposition there.
Very deeply.
And is beginning to use reason above the culturally inherited stories.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. That's super interesting. So he's starting to highlight the use of the mind and reason and thinking, okay, if we're this way and it's starting to sound like cataphatic theology, like we were talking about earlier. If I'm good, then God would be the best.
Yeah, and I'm glad you pointed that. I forget, I think that was episode 7 or 8 we talked about that, if anyone wants to go into that term and the idea behind that. Yeah, and that's where he's going with this. And I think you're right to see the distinction there, quite a bit different than where everyone else in his culture was going to.
Yeah, the interesting thing is that he's using morality as a defining factor that kind of separates the God, uppercase G, from humans or any kind of lesser, lowercase g gods.
Yes. Morality plus the idea that God would not be able to be deceived, or God would not be tricked, or God would not move or act in a war or something like that. Those things would be below him.
Okay.
Not simply below his morality or even the tension, but he's so far exalted above all these things. There's a couple things he says about God. He doesn't need anything, so you can stop sacrificing those animals, right? And that's very similar to the idea that would arise in the Hebrew or Christian tradition of God's aseity, that he has all things in himself.
Oh, yeah, I remember talking about that too in an earlier episode.
Right. And then he says about this God, quote, "He sees all over, he thinks all over, he hears all over, he remains always in the same place without moving, but without toil he sets all things in motion by the thoughts of his mind." So this is very different than the Greek gods, some of whom would actually be in battle, some of whom were wounded in battle. This God isn't like that.
This is super interesting because it's starting to, of course, using anachronistic theological categories to think through this, but it's starting to sound a little bit like omniscience.
Yeah, in some ways.
A little bit like immutability.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's approaching certain conceptions of God that seem pretty relevant, and also, like you mentioned, in that Hebrew stream of thought.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so you said the third advance of Xenophanes is that he makes advances in the area of epistemology. Can you explain that, define that a little bit?
Sure. An easy definition of epistemology would be the study of what we can know or not know and how we can know it. So what can we know, and then the methods of knowing it related to that. What are the warrants for believing something? How would you discern truth from error? That kind of thing. Here's a statement of his that's really quite remarkable. He's talking about all these ideas and that he's mentioning. It says, "The gods have not revealed all things from the beginning to mortals." So this isn't received from the mortals like the Delphic oracle or the myths and traditions. "But by seeking, men find out in time what is better." So by seeking, and I think what he means is reasoning, investigation, we come to a better understanding. And then he goes on, though. He says this is interesting. "No man knows the truth, nor will there be a man who has knowledge about the gods and what I say about everything. For even if he were to hit by chance upon the whole truth, he himself would not be aware of having done so. But each forms his own opinions. Let these things then be taken as like the truth, end quote.
Okay, interesting quote there. What's he saying there? Can you help us understand it?
Yeah. Well, first, he explicitly lays out our criteria for knowing, and he's really the first, I believe, to do so. What is it? It's by seeking and investigating and reasoning that we come to know, and so he's laying out that methodology for knowing. Second, he's also the first to state that we cannot know the truth, or at least all the truth, and this position is usually called skepticism. So in philosophy, skepticism is not doubting or denying some particular belief, for example, the existence of God, but rather it's doubting whether we can have true beliefs at all. He's thinking primarily of the things he's been talking about, that is the nature of reality and the nature of God, and he said, we can't really know the truth. Now, two problems arise, though, when you start down the skeptical road. First, it becomes difficult to know where you stop being a skeptic. For example, can we not have knowledge of mathematical or geometric truths? Or can we not have knowledge of the direct evidence of our senses? Now, to say no to that would be the position of radical skepticism, and most skeptics would reject that. But it's difficult to know on what grounds. Where's the rationale for saying that we can have true knowledge about some things, but not others? Where's the line involved? That's a difficult question to answer. And then the second problem with skepticism is that it seems self-defeating, where it's making a truth claim that you can't know the truth while denying the validity of truth claims, as Plato pointed out.
So he's foundational in this philosophical category of skepticism, but you said in the past, okay, he can make this claim, but he doesn't have philosophical grounds to really make it.
Yeah, he can make this claim, and I think what's important here is that, as far as I know, he's the first one to make it.
Okay, so your point is just that he's a pillar in philosophical understanding.
Yeah. So he is the one who really introduces a lot of deep questions that we're still wrestling with. He's kind of the first one to say, just by his own stance, that these are things we're going to have to wrestle with.
So did he himself recognize these problems and respond to them?
From what we have of his writings, he did not address these problems. But we probably don't have all his writings, so it's possible he did, but no, based on the historical record. But his skeptical stance will introduce them into this great conversation, as I mentioned. Now, one other thing he does here related to this, that's the last thing I want to mention, for it's also important for philosophy, and in particular epistemology. He's going to introduce a distinction between knowledge and belief. So he said, if you remember that quote, we cannot know these things, but, quote, they should be taken as like the truth, end quote.
Oh, yeah, I remember unpacking this in previous episodes.
Yeah, we talked about this in episodes 4 and 5. Plato's going to develop this contrast between knowledge and belief more fully. And then Kant and Kierkegaard will also make much of this distinction. And I think very importantly, I think a lot of people don't realize the importance of this distinction and how actually helpful it can be to live out a philosophy of life. But so anyway, Xenophanes is the first one that I know of that introduces this distinction between belief and knowledge.
So it sounds like Xenophanes is an outlier in Greek philosophy.
Yeah, he really is. And because of that, he advances philosophy as a whole in ways that we're going to see in most of the episodes ahead.
Yeah, wow. That's going to be great. So speaking of episodes ahead, what's next for us?
Well, in the next episode, we're going to look at one of the, arguably, two most important pre-Socratic Greek philosophers, a man who started a movement that lasted 1,000 years, the man with the golden thigh, Pythagoras.
Sounds good.
Yeah, until then.